Excellency Philip Min, Professor K.C. Abraham, Dr. Dhanuraj, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by saying that Professor Dhanuraj, in his very eloquent introduction, as far as I was concerned, made one very significant mistake. He said I will be 81. I wish to counter that and say I'm just about 41. Just 40 years down the road. And somewhere down the road my parents made a mistake because I've had 60 years almost in government service, but my age isn't anywhere near that. But for that, I accept everything that he said, knowing that most of it is hyperbole anyway. Dr. Dhanuraj, Professor Matthew, thank you for affording me this privilege of inaugurating the third international conference, this one on the US Rebalance and the Asia Pacific region. I am happy that the Center for Strategic Studies has embarked on this endeavor to develop a knowledge base on the Asia Pacific region and also to focus on US relations with the region. I am sure that the expectations of the organizers that the conference outcome will help participants understand the evolving nature of the strategic environment and its significance for India will be more than fulfilled. I propose to sort of divide my talk today into four different sections, followed by a conclusion. Briefly to start with, I think the conference brief has highlighted the centrality of the Asia Pacific in the strategic domain in the 21st century. And towards that end, I think there are a number of building blocks that have led to the US rebalance to Asia. First was the foreign policy article written by my favorite diplomat, then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That was in the year 2011, when she declared that the history of the 21st century would be scripted in Asia, stressing further that the Asia Pacific had become a key driver of global politics. The article underscored very heavily the importance attached by the Obama administration to the Asia Pacific. Next, what followed was the announcement by President Obama himself of his strategic decision, and I quote, that as a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long-term role in shaping this region and its future. Quote ends. This announcement of the US pivot to Asia, however, seemed to raise China's hackles. This possibly led the US Defense Department shortly thereafter in January 2012 to shift gear and elaborate that the US will, and I quote, of necessity rebalance towards the Asia Pacific region by strengthening existing alliances, encouraging new partners, and investing in necessary military capabilities. Quote ends. This year, in his address to the nation, President Obama has once again reiterated that, and I quote again, fulfilling our responsibilities depends on a strong defense and secure homeland. It also requires a global security posture in which our unique capabilities are employed within diverse international coalitions and in support of local partners. Quote ends. The US President said, and I again quote again, that the US will remain a Pacific power. The security dynamics of the region risk escalation and conflict. American leadership will remain essential to shaping the region's long-term trajectory to enhance stability and security. Quote ends. Towards this end, he said, the US would diversify its security relationships in Asia, as also its defense posture and presence. He further affirmed that the US supports India's role as a regional provider of security and sees a strategic convergence between India's Act East policy and the US rebalance to Asia and the Pacific. So, that is the backdrop in which we are going to discuss today the US rebalance to Asia. I start off by talking of the problematic Asia. The 21st century is often referred to as the Asian century. The Asian Development Bank has said that by 2050 or even earlier, Asia would nearly double its share of the global GDP to about 52%. Also that Asia would regain the dominant economic position it once held some 3 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution. The future belongs to Asia not only because it is the world's most populous region, but also because the image of a resurgent Asia has captured the imagination of the world. This is happening at a time of exponentially accelerating change, with new paradigms of thought, action and behavior overtaking and replacing old ones. The international spotlight on Asia's dramatic rise should not, however, obscure the serious challenges that it confronts. This is a region beset by both centrifugal and centripetal forces. While Asian economies are integrated to a considerable extent, at the political and strategic level, Asia has emerged as a theater of conflict and rivalries. Currently, Asia is beset by several outstanding territorial disputes. There are, in addition, undetermined and contested claims regarding the sea, largely spurred by China's ever-widening maritime claims in the South China and East China Seas. Some of these extend more than 1,000 kilometers off China's southern coast, for which there are multiple claimants. For example, China and Japan have a dispute over the Senkaku-Dayo Islands in the East China Sea, while the Philippines and Vietnam contest China's claims in the South China Sea. Nations across the Indo-Pacific, meanwhile, have become highly conscious of their rights and obligations under the provisions of the new Law of the Sea under the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS 3. Many of the disputes are motivated by oil and gas reserves, lucrative fishing grounds, and the security of the sea lanes, essential to the economies of these countries. The vast majority of their imports and exports come via the sea. Deep seabed mining has emerged as a new and strategic issue. Mining of sulfide deposits to phosphorus module mining for phosphorus fertilizers has further aggravated interstate competition. China has recently secured an international deep seabed block in the southwestern Indian Ocean from the International Seabed Authority to explore for polymetallic sulfides. You can quite understand why the sea has become so important. The 10-member ASEAN is today sharply divided. Even as the confrontation between Vietnam and China in the South China Sea escalates, that between the Philippines and China in the East China Sea has intensified, and Malaysia and Brunei are involved in disputes in the sea with China. Nevertheless, hardly any of the Asian countries is ready to enter into a conflict with the aspiring regional hegemon, namely China. Participants, China is increasingly perceived in the region as a nation anxious to expand its strategic footprint across the continent. China's forward policies, especially its maritime claims, are widely seen as an act of calculated confrontation. Beijing's aggressive assertiveness is now extending beyond its historic waters, those confined within the 9 dashed lines of the Chinese claim lines, and goes well beyond the first island chain, moving further afield. All this has greatly widened the fault lines across the Indo-Pacific. This brings me to discuss the US rebalance to Asia. The whys and wherefores of the US rebalance to Asia and the Asia-Pacific should be considered in this backdrop. The very first question that arises, I hope you won't mind, Excellency, my raising this. The very first question that arises is, what is the US interest in effecting such a rebalance? And what should one make of it? Is the US rebalancing to Asia solely because Asia is a new locus of economic power and growth? Or is it because if the US is not there, it would soon be elbowed out of the region by the rising and emerging power in the region, namely China? No easy answers are available. There is also another and subliminal question, often glossed over by US commentators and strategists. Ingrid, I hope you won't mind my referring to this, for which an answer is urgently needed. This is why, after announcing the so-called pivot to Asia, and with such fanfare, implying that the US would be intensifying its role in the Asia-Pacific in a way that it had not done before, the US, even before the ink had dried on this, shifted emphasis to rebalance to Asia, thus indicating a lowering of priorities. This pirouette is yet to be satisfactorily explained, notwithstanding the volumes of material put out concerning the US rebalance to the Asia-Pacific. The US pivot to Asia was possibly one of the most widely acclaimed decisions of any US government as far as Asian nations were concerned. Even countries like India, which had for long taken the position that it was better to have less rather than more US presence in the region, were willing to countenance this step. Most Asian countries saw the US pivot to Asia as providing them a guarantee to withstand the challenge posed by an aggressively rising China. With the possible exception of India, almost every other country on the Asian continent nurses grave concerns as to where China is headed. The objective conditions hence favored closer concert between Asian nations and the United States. Instead, I dare say the US seemed to turn matters on its head and shift emphasis from containment to rebalance. This cannot but and has affected the image of the United States in Asia. Rather than be the guarantor of their security and help check the robustness of China's rise, the US seemed to opt out. For the smaller countries of Asia, given China's size, economic strength, and military capabilities, the issue was one of survival, and US reluctance seemed like a letdown. US strategic analysts have produced many a dissertation to explain why managing, within quotes, a rising China had to be different from the tactic of containment within quotes again, adopted vis-a-vis Russia in the past. The difference, they claim, arose from the unprecedented economic linkages and interdependence that existed between China and the United States, unlike the situation that existed between the United States and Russia. Resorting to rebalancing, it is hence argued, is the most appropriate methodology to suit this kind of situation. It involves closer cooperation with a number of allies in a bid to defang is my word, rather than confront the Chinese tiger. Your Excellency, notwithstanding the brilliance of the arguments produced in this respect, dominant sentiment in Asia, I should think, is of US unwillingness or inability to take on China. It reminds me of an incident a little over a year ago. at a conference that I was attending in the south of France, where a very senior and high-profile diplomat, I don't want to mention his name, from an Arab country, explicitly stated, in the context of the raging conflict in Syria, Iraq at the time, that the United States in the 21st century often made commitments that could be likened to lines on the sand. Their assurances were seldom fulfilled. My good friend and former National Security Advisor, Tom Dumoulin, in 2012, put forward the argument that, I quote, "The rebalance is ultimately oriented to make certain that international norms and laws are respected, that emerging powers build trust with their neighbors, and disagreements are resolved peacefully without threats or coercion." Quote ends. In the true spirit of international diplomacy, this is a good diplomatic explanation. The reality, however, is that China already existed as a state when the US announced its pivot to Asia, and hence an explanation is needed as to why the US backtracked almost immediately. China's rise has been tracked for more than 3 decades, ever since Deng Xiaoping embarked on his decision to transform China. Hopefully, we, the countries of Asia, hope that it is not because the current crop of Chinese leaders have decided to abandon Deng's 24-character strategy. Observe calmly, secure your position, cope with affairs calmly, hide your capacities and bide your time, maintain a low profile and never claim leadership. The Chinese obviously no longer wish to merely observe. They are anxious to ensure that the region is created in their image. This is what causes jitters among Asian nations, especially those in Southeast and East Asia. Admittedly, China poses a challenge very different from the one the US faced while confronting and containing Russia during the Cold War. In the case of China, the competition again is no doubt in geopolitical and military terms, but complicated by the fact that the US and Chinese economies are deeply intertwined at present. This is said to make it difficult to adopt a policy of containment. Rebalancing therefore implies to most Asian nations something of an integrated strategy short of containment that involves diplomatic, economic, as well as military components. The strategic component is the one that most concerns Asian nations. The basic question for which an answer is needed is whether, in furtherance of its commitment that international norms and laws should be respected, the United States proposes to maintain requisite military capabilities in the region. I hope Mr. Tibbert would answer this question in his address. This alone would reassure US allies and other Asian nations that the US means business. Conveying conviction is not going to be easy, for US policy at present does not favor putting any of its own assets at risk, and the US and the United States currently focuses more on expeditionary capabilities, mainly sea and air power. Given by Beijing's missile and nuclear capabilities, possessing the second largest land forces in the world, and steaming ahead in creating a blue water capability, there is hence more than a nagging concern among Asian countries about the depth of the US commitment to Asia, which needs to be answered. The diplomatic component of the rebalancing strategy hinges on building partnerships with key states in Asia, from Japan to Korea, Taiwan to Singapore to Australia, and of course India. None of the US allies, nor any of the nations in Asia, are sanguine that US hopes for a peaceful resolution of disputes in the South and East China Sea will be fulfilled. There are possibly better chances of maintaining peace as far as continental disputes are concerned. For example, the 3,500 kilometer Sino-Indian border remains tranquil since the two countries maintain roughly equal forces along the disputed border. There is thus much riding on hopes and intentions as far as success of the rebalancing strategy is concerned. I would say that success of the rebalancing strategy is by no means preordained. Hardly any one of the countries in Asia, with the exception of India, has the capacity to individually stand up China. Close collaboration with the United States would have been the answer, but most countries are uncertain about US intentions and its willingness to risk involvement in a conflict on their behalf against China. My next segment deals with China, India, and the US rebalance to Asia. Re-emergence of China in the 21st century poses a clear challenge to the United States and also to India, but in different ways. The challenge to the United States is that China's rise has the potential to undermine the US-backed security system in Asia. This could possibly shut out the US from the region. China's growing preeminence is a challenge to India as well. For it would be for the first time in history that India has at its doorstep an aggressive power which sees India as a rival, or at least as a potential rival. At the same time, both in the case of the United States and of India, China is a key commercial partner. Both hence have to maintain a balance between a geopolitical competitor with ever-widening ambitions and an economic partner. China and India already have competing and contradictory priorities on most strategic and civilizational issues. These include Asian security, regional stability, and virtues of a Sino-centric world order replacing current polarities. China is presently in the midst of its ongoing third revolution, the results of which have so far been positive. China watchers, however, see a dangerous trend of increasing nationalistic fervor, a growing belief in its own exceptionalism and uniqueness, alongside an unwillingness to accommodate and compromise when it comes to matters relating to its perceived security. This, according to China watchers, could have unforeseen consequences. President Xi Jinping of China has perhaps emerged as the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. This has happened even as China's top leaders are struggling to govern collectively, while called upon to deal with an increasingly complex Asia. Experts believe that the amalgam of an ancient civilization and a huge modern state can, in China's case, prove highly incendiary. As China expands its military, it could also lead to certain eventualities when it comes to protecting China's core interests, mainly sovereignty and territorial integrity, reclaiming all lost, single quotes, lost territories claimed by China at one time or the other, and setting right historical wrongs, again within quotes. Possessing one of the largest land forces in the world, having a substantial missile and nuclear capability, and aiming to have one of the most formidable naval forces in the world, China cannot any longer be viewed as an enigma. India's approach to the situation that prevails in the region is different. In contrast to China's growing assertiveness, India only seeks to enhance its strategic space and ensure its strategic autonomy. Any talk, however, of India's so-called vulnerability, or to treat it as a premature power, as some do, would be misplaced. India is today confident of its own strength and standing, and it is the only country in the Asian region capable of standing up to China. India's effort is to see that the power differential between India and China does not increase to the point where China feels it could threaten India's position in Asia. The current reality is that despite the Chinese military buildup, China does not have any major advantage vis-à-vis India. China's land forces are larger than that of India, but it has a much longer border to defend. India has raised 2 new specialized mountain divisions, which are to be positioned in areas close to the border with China. India's Air Force, especially India's fleet of supersonic planes, including the Sukhoi 30 MKI, compares very favorably with anything that the Chinese Air Force possesses at present. India is currently engaged in a massive upgradation of its Air Force. India is well on its way to becoming a 2-aircraft carrier navy and possesses an array of stealth frigates and 1 nuclear submarine, with another likely to be inducted shortly. India is also proposing to spend several billions of US dollars on capital defense acquisitions on items such as land-based and carrier-based aircraft, stealth frigates, enhanced naval surveillance capabilities, etc. What, therefore, the US rebalance to Asia needs to factor in at this time are the implications of certain recent pronouncements of Chinese President Xi, namely, renewal of the Chinese nation, the desire to sell the Chinese dream, the concept of the maritime Silk Route, and the emphasis put on expeditionary forces to deal with problems affecting the sea. Chinese exceptionalism today is largely historical and revivalist, and this poses a danger to all countries which have an interest in Asia. The US rebalance to Asia must hence try and strengthen an alternative vision of Asian stability in the absence of a proper security architecture that can help maintain the balance and bring peace to the region. Finally, since we are here in India, I would say that from India's standpoint, there are certain incompatibilities between Washington's rebalancing strategy and India's priorities. India is, however, conscious that the gap today is not of the kind or of the order that existed during the Cold War years, when Washington's strategies directed at the containment of the then Soviet Union were totally at odds with India's attitudes at the time. Nevertheless, India does not, at present, see itself as seeking to contain China individually or in concert with the United States. India favors maintaining a certain level of strategic autonomy and retaining its independence of judgment and actions, even while being part of multiplex arrangements involving a number of states, including whether they be countries with which it has entered into strategic or cooperative partnerships. India has forged several circles of engagement with countries across the globe, including the United States and Russia, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, the European Union and Japan, countries in India's immediate and extended neighborhood, and with China, with which country India today has a strategic and cooperative partnership. With many of these countries, India has in place strategic dialogues which have produced useful results. Participants here today I'd like to remind them that India-US relations have not always been smooth. During the Cold War years, relations were decidedly frosty. The US rapprochement with China during the Nixon administration further complicated India-US relations. This persisted through the Reagan and Clinton administrations, which became further exacerbated in the wake of India's nuclear tests in 1998. It was only after the advent of the George W. Bush administration, which viewed India as part of the solution to nuclear proliferation, rather than as part of the problem, that US-India relations became transformed. By and large, the legacy of the past has been overtaken by the warmth that has prevailed during the past decade. In the context of the US rebalance to Asia and the Asia Pacific, the US would do well to realize that its success is dependent on the extent to which the United States and India are on the same wavelength or on the same page, and are able to arrive at a realistic entente on the objectives of the rebalance. I would end by saying that the US cannot hope to go it alone, or hope to succeed only with the support of the smaller nations. India must factor very highly in the designs of the United States.